Shukran. And half a day. Buenas, everybody. Welcome to this special episode of Fanachu. I'm Monaeka Flores, and I'm a member of Prutehi, Litekyan, as well as Independent Guåhan. And I'm just so honored today to have with us Dr. Isa Arriola in Saipan. She's actually calling in from Saipan right now, where she lives and works and lives with her beautiful family. And I'm really honored to have Isa. Isa, welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here with you, my sister.
Isa Arriola, Dr. Isa Arriola, I'm so excited to have you. For everybody, just to introduce you to Isa, Isa is a creative capsule resident and an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University. And even though she's working there, she's living here at home, working and living here full time in Saipan. She chairs our Commonwealth 670 OCW 670 on Saipan, a community advocacy group dedicated to research, education, and awareness about military planning in the Mariana Islands. She was born and raised on Saipan as an indigenous Samoro woman and Kosrayan woman, and her research interests center around militarism, indigeneity, sovereignty, and Oceania. And we're here to talk about some of the amazing work Isa's been involved with. And Isa, it's just such an honor to have you, my good friend. She's also my good friend. we talk on a very regular basis, actually, just about every day or every other day about language and words and meaning and making meaning out of the language around our lived experiences as colonized people of the Mariana Islands, as people who are experiencing colonization in real time. And it's really an honor to be with you here. I mean, we also do a lot of work together in Marianas for Palestine. And, you know, before we started the webinar, I'm sorry, the Fanachu episode, you and I were talking about, you know, just how we should pause for a second as well to just acknowledge and think about, you know, all of the horrible atrocities happening in real time right now in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Rafah right now. And as we're talking about language, about militarization, about war, about colonization, we are doing it, of course, from a place of privilege to do this work and to have this conversation. But you know, also as people who are definitely surviving the linked colonial realities, the linked militarized realities. Of course, you and I always talk about how the things happening here, the destruction to our lands and waters, the desecration of our sacred lands, our sacred areas, our ancestral burials, and the contamination of our land is directly connected to the war games, the training, the military buildup, all of these words we're going to talk about that's happening here in throughout the Mariana Islands, and of course in the larger Micronesian region. And it's quite overwhelming. We're inundated with a lot of words in media, and we do a lot of work as activists, and I thought let's kind of start there. Maybe we could start with talking about the word activist, and how you identify with that word and what that word's come to mean in our communities and in our experiences. And but I'd love to hand it off to you, Isa. Thank you so much, my good friend, my chelu, for being here and active with me.
Thank you so much for that beautiful, beautiful introduction. And yes, the acknowledgement of this really critical moment, this time, and this privilege to have this conversation and these conversations with one another, and seeing ourselves as, you know, linked to everything that we're seeing in the news, right? That we know is happening before us. And the responsibility too that we bear, right? And I think that's why we're here to have this conversation. But I do also just want to quickly give you and Miget Vivarqua a huge shout out. Thank you for inviting me on to have this conversation, but also just to both of you for the incredible work that you're doing. You know, the movement would be nowhere really, without your hard work, your dedication, your service. This is service to the community, what you do day in and day out. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, and just very honored to be working with you, alongside you, and to be able to have these conversations. So thank you so much. I know there's a lot going on. So yeah, how do we kick it off? Activist. I am of the, like, I don't know what you would call it, of the camp where that word, I think is often tossed around really negatively. And to kind of downplay, the expertise that a lot of Indigenous women have in these spaces, especially, decolonial or demilitarization spaces, and we've had on Saipan, we've had conversations about this with our dear and late Sinta Kaipat, who is such an instrumental part of, co-founding our Commonwealth 670 a few years back now. But this was a distinct conversation that we had, and we said, let's try to shift gears and, push the conversation towards advocates, right? Rather than having this negative term activist, although we don't want that to take away from the work being done, right? Because I think as Indigenous people, waking up, you're an activist, right? Talking about your land, you're an activist. So all of those things become part of who you are, right? It doesn't have to be such a distinct category. It's just the kind of reality, our histories, right? That put us in that position, right? But if you're always just kind of downplaying, or I guess erasing the work of someone else by saying they're an activist, and I think that really does a disservice to, a lot of the contributions that we're all making in these conversations, right? And also there's this sense that maybe you can't be an activist and an expert, right, at a particular topic at the same time. And like, if there's anything that's shown me with the community work here at home and in Guåhan, it's like the opposite, right? Is that activism is really motivated by the expertise, and the expertise is really motivated by the activism and the actions and the community work, right? So I've always felt that, yes, I occupy this very privileged position as an academic, but I can't unsee the way that it's connected to the work on the ground, to life experiences, right? I literally wanted to learn more about this process of militarization because I was at home, experiencing what was then like the very, very early conversations about the quote unquote buildup, So those were conversations. And then seeing Julian's work, for example, Julian Uggun's work, coming out at the time, it was a really like a coalescing of all of these different, personal experiences with the academy. And the academy gave me time to really think and theorize about what we were seeing and experiencing around us, like from our perspective, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think maybe we need to, we're always reclaiming the positive dimensions of what that word means. I want to know what you think.
You're absolutely right. Like, just as marginalized people to begin with, we're from these communities that are historically oppressed, politically, oppressed. We're colonized people, and that's why we're having this conversation. And so, to kind of come from that and then be criticized for becoming an activist is really something that just feels incongruent. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't make sense. We're using our voice for our agency, and and when anytime someone criticizes an activist, or says an activist is sort of doing something that's useless or superfluous, it's a shame. It's harmful because really it's undermining Indigenous agency. It's undermining
Right.
so many things and all the important work that we do as activists. I mean, and you and I talk about this all the time, especially in terms of language and in trying to really help to explain things or to share information with our folks. We're always looking at the language that's being used in the media we consume, in the resources that are being circulated in our community. And in our work as activists, we're helping to build media literacy. We're doing critique of media and also helping our community build capacity to do this kind of critical thinking and critique. But we're also like unpacking things and re-examining things and redefining things for ourselves when language doesn't fit. And that's a very powerful position to come from. But of course, we're up against a lot because we're often trying to push against a dominant narrative, a dominant a language that's kind of used to trick us and hide things from us. So let's go ahead and get into that. You've been involved in some really amazing projects. And of course, we're here to talk about your project with Inkstick, the little book of Pentagon words in the Pacific. But I also thought we could start by talking about a few other projects you've been involved with. Words about war matter. And so let's get into that. These are a few different kinds of language guides to help folks re-examine the words we use around war and militarization, and I find these guides amazing and something that folks can use and come back to over and over again, and even things that our leaders should look at, our elected officials should look at, things our local media should look at, as well as our own folks so that we can even reconsider the language that we're all using when we talk about ourselves and our experiences as militarized, as colonized people, and as people who are basically in communities that are being set up to be sites of war and have been sites of war historically. And so I would love to get into that project. Maybe you could start by telling us how you got involved and who was involved and how these things developed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so thank you. I can maybe I'll wait to share my screen, or I can start it up actually, if that works. But just a bit about the kind of origin of this language guide. David Vine, who's a professor at American University and who's been really instrumental to kind of documenting the base building presence, and is part of a broader movement to close bases, the Overseas Base Realignment and Closure or group called OBRAC. He really, was instrumental in trying to get all different kinds of folks from, community members, activists, academics, people in think tanks, like policy experts, and on the guide, there's a whole list of names at the bottom. I can't even list them because there's so many amazing folks that have been part of this conversation. But really, he was bringing us together for this conversation about, how, and this was a few years ago now, so this is in 2022, about how we could seriously think about, concrete strategies to dismantle the military industrial complex, right? So this really circular problem that's keeping us stuck in this cycle of dependency on militarism and spending more and more money on militarization and military projects, right? And so basically that cycle is taking taxpayer dollars. Congress is using that, to sell to essentially contractors that then continue to militarize the community more. And then you take more tax dollars, and all of a sudden you have this endless cycle, right, of where we don't even know where we're going anymore. The US budget is now like $1 trillion, right, that's being spent on the Pentagon. And so out of this initial conversation, we had a very large summit where all of us kind of came together. And one of the things that came out of these conversations was this language guide, right? Because we were really, again, we were thinking of, how do we bring a resource to the community that's useful, that could be used by policy experts, could be used by, I don't know, someone in the media, a podcaster, right, in the classroom, even just like talking to one another, right? And so I'll pull up my screen here to put up. You see that? Okay. So this is actually the guide, right? So this is what came out of the conversation. And a lot of what we were talking about was the power of words, right? For describing this hyper militarization that we're witnessing, right? In the US, out here in the quote unquote Indo-Pacific, right? Even the region, even the word about the region is being militarized, right, where we are. And so we came up with this kind of, final list here, with all of these different terms. And they were terms that you could avoid, and then kind of better alternatives and ways to describe, the terminology and kind of why you shouldn't really do that, right? Um, and, you know, and we'll talk about a little bit later on is kind of what I was thinking about, right? Like while we were creating this guide, we have a very particular perspective coming from the Pacific, right? Talking about these words. So in the process of creating this guide, it was also a learning experience for me to see how, like, what words really stood out in the kind of continental US, right? And what words were almost in some ways like more important out here, not more important, but we're really, I was seeing we see over and over again in the media, for example, right? And so I was thinking, okay, there has to be a more kind of specific guide to the Pacific, to the Pacific, right? But in the meantime, this guide was born, and the hope was that it would spark conversations about, a lot about the ways that stereotypes and biases and propaganda in the media that we're seeing are so prevalent, right? And how, words can really be used to dehumanize a whole entire group of people, right? And the way that words take whole diverse groups of folks and mesh them with their government as if what their government is saying, is what they believe, wholeheartedly. And so a lot of these terms are really, they're euphemisms, they're really, really violent terms that we just kind of throw around. And so we wanted to take a step back and say, you know, we're talking about violent killing and death and murder here, right? But we'll say something like collateral damage, right? Or the Pentagon will say something like collateral damage, when it's talking about a death that happened by accident, right? And there's so many other terms that you can think of probably, right, that you hear coming out of the Pentagon. And I want to flag too that it's really difficult to do this when you've been taught that talking about this institution is, there's kind of one way of doing it. And that's why I am constantly saying Pentagon instead of Department of Defense, because that was also one of the kind of terms that continued to come up, was this idea of defense and Department of Defense, because there's so much money being spent on warmongering at the moment. It really just didn't even make sense to call it defense anymore, right? So being really specific, that was also one of the conversations that came out of this language guide was, let's be specific. Who are we talking about here, right? If we're talking about a branch, talk about that branch, right? If you're talking about a group, like what group are you talking about? And importantly, who's killing who, right? Because that matters. It actually matters. And so the specificity, there's a power in the specificity of calling things out more truthfully. And that's really what we were trying to get at, right? Like, it doesn't really matter where you fall on a political spectrum. There's a truth to what's happening, right? In conflict, in times of war, during genocide. These are very real processes that we have to call out for what they are, right? And we cannot actively be a part of these killings, of the way that we, narrate what we're seeing before our eyes, right? We don't want to be complicit in that. And of course, this doesn't relieve people of complicity, but it does help us to be much more honest about what's happening in the world, right? And around us. So out of that conversation came this other guide. I don't know if you want to move to that yet. but these, really emerged out of the genocide that we're seeing in Palestine. So I'll give you a second if there's any other things you wanted to ask, but this, of course, in the middle of creating the other guide, we're seeing this active genocide unfolding, right? And we felt like, wow, there's a lot of things happening in the media right now that we need to address. And so we came out with these 10 urgent suggestions here that you see. And both of these guides are downloadable at wordsaboutwar.org, by the way. And they're in PDF format, so they're easily shareable. They're in easily shareable formats that you can send to folks and talk about with each other.
Yeah, these are just, I find these both to be just really great resources. I think like even the word genocide, we're hearing, of course, genocide has has a legal definition. It has there are conditions that sort of qualify genocide right now, and that's been debated in the media. And to hear the president of the United States, Biden, recently just deny that what's happening is a genocide. It's a horrible fallacy. It's a horrible lie. Even throwing around words and phrases like democracy in the Middle East, that Israel is democracy in the Middle East. And of course, definitely this language that humanizes some and dehumanizes others. If we look at a lot of mainstream media, there is a different tone in describing, Israeli hostages versus the many Palestinian hostages and prisoners that Israel has been held captive, and many children that they've imprisoned. I mean, it's really we're seeing this all playing out in real time. And so this the use of language in media, how it's used to minimize the violence, minimize the reality of, minimize war crimes, even using something like the word war crimes, that's being denied when we're watching imposed man-made famine and starvation. We're watching the use of white phosphorus, and then people denying that these are war crimes happening, denying there's a genocide happening. It's and also the precision strikes. This is a really powerful example of that language. I mean, if that's something that you see people debating, like if they have the technology or the skill to make these strikes, then why is it this massive carpet bombing, and of course the wholesale bombing of schools and shelters and hospitals just happening. But anyhow, there's
Drones,
just
the same with drone, right? That's on there. Like it's a drone killing, right? Well, who's doing the killing, right? Who's operating the drone? Who was killed? Who was murdered, right? So that's part of the clarity, right, in the language. Yeah, especially when it comes to tech, we're seeing a lot of that emerging too, conversations about the tech being used, right, to murder and kill, but just how, I guess, invisible the tech even more invisible the tech, makes this process unfold.
right. It's used, the language is used to make things abstract, to make them less tangible, less concrete for people to understand. It muddies the meaning of a lot of things. And even things like people killed versus dead, even those differences, right? Even the words murdered and slaughtered, let's say that Israel has slaughtered 15,000 children. Israel has murdered, over 500 medical workers and over 150 journalists. That's that language. That's accurate. That's the accurate, truthful thing to say. But we see in a lot of the media that we consume that there's hesitancy or obstruction to using the direct, honest language. And so, of course, looking at those two guides, like you were saying earlier, we can look at those two guides, and then we really need to even break those down even further to see how they apply to our specific context as
Right.
people in the Marianas, as colonized Pacific Islanders. And so this great resource then that you developed next, the little book of Pentagon Words in the Pacific with Inkstick Media publishing it. This is such a great piece, such a fantastic resource. And one of the words that I love that's in this that's also in the other guide that we just talked about is deterrence. And I know we'll get into some of that, but like that's something. I mean, you and I also talk about just how propaganda, we're just so inundated with propaganda, like that you know, with greenwashing, with brownwashing,
Right.
and we'll get into that more, but like even the reality of the actual contamination that we have, the amount, the levels of illness in our community, people suffering from illnesses associated to this contamination, the land loss, like these realities that we are still we really face every day. Like in a few days, RICA is gonna expire, and Guam's still, you know, trying to get recognized, and they may deny funding for radiation survivors, and yet say, but they're here to protect us and keep us safe with the missile defense system. You know,
Right.
it's just really, there's just such a huge disconnect, and
Yeah.
we would think that more of our folks then would be more critical, would question more, would call out some of the language more, and we want that, of course. We're hoping for that, and so that's why these guys are so important. That's why this conversation is so important. But let's
Yeah.
let's do that right now. The
Yeah.
contextual, for us.
I mean, just to speak to what you were just saying though, too, you know, I mean, I think that's more reason why language is so critical, right? Because I think part of the answer, at least in this process that I've been learning to that question, is why, you know, why aren't we critiquing more? Why don't we have more voice in this process, right? And I think it's precisely because the language it makes you feel okay, like half the time, you know, like the language is, you know, I wrote a piece connected to this booklet that I'm going to talk about in a second, but I think I titled it something like "Making War Feel Good," like island style, you know, like in the media. And so like what I was trying to get at was thinking of all the different ways that you know, we're so pacified into like what are the words that are used to justify so much of what's happening around us. And it's not just that it justifies and that there's consequences of, you know, there's actual changes that are happening on, you know, all of our environment and around us because um of these words, but that like we're really cool with it, that it's okay, you know, that it almost feels good to participate in the kind of narrative and the rhetoric that comes out about something like preparing for war, you know. And so um you know, I have the guide up. If you go through the other language guide that I was just talking about, I wanted to mention before I move on to the other project, there are just some really, you know, um critical like pieces of advice and guidance that came all out of the expertise that of this conversation that we were having, right? But a lot of the ways that we're pacified are through the use of this metaphor. So one of the suggestions was like avoid sports metaphors, right? Or avoid medical metaphors to talk about war, for example, right? War is not a medical practice. War is not a sport. Like, don't talk about them in those ways, right? Because again, that's not being honest about the process. So I mean, essentially what came out of, you know, being from Saipan and us being here where we are, when I'm working with mostly US based folks, in this process, I kept thinking about, you know, gosh, there are so many words. And because my research has dealt so much with militarization throughout the years, there's just been certain terms. I actually kept like a running list on my phone that I called Marianas monikers, because every time they'd come up, I'd be like, this is really problematic, right? Like, how can we, again, you mentioned this earlier, but how can we unpack this term? Like, and also like, where did it come from? You know, like the buildup, for example, when did buildup go from like a verb to like a proper noun almost, you know, where we're like capitalizing the B and buildup, and we just talk about it like it's this thing that we don't even have to question anymore, right? So I'll share my screen here again. But this is the cover of the book, right? So can you see that? Yeah, so I decided to call it the Little Book of Pentagon Words in the Pacific, right? Because again, I wanted to give a more specific flavor, I guess, to the language guide, and to really have the opportunity to dig in a really creative way, right? So the language guide is more almost pragmatic in a way, like, you know, you've got the words and then different kind of suggestions for how to replace those words. But I really wanted to delve into like a creative process almost. And so for the last 8 months, I've been involved in this residency called Creative Capsule Residency with Inkstick and Bombshell Toe Media. And it basically, you know, was a conversation that fused the creative arts with public policy. Right? And I thought this was a really great opportunity to, again, to think about these words that are used to describe the process of militarization, all these different angles of militarization around us, and take a step back and really think about what these terms mean, and also hold them in. I mean, I was thinking of this way of like lifting the words off the page, right? When I was initially kind of designing the booklet, like, how do I take these words and lift them off the page so we're not so comfortable with them anymore, you know, trying to make them less familiar, I guess. We've become so comfortable with these terms, right? And, you know, so there's a foreword that I have in the book, but I just want to read a little bit of it. So I put, this booklet offers us a chance to reflect on some of these terms and examine their significance in our everyday lives. If the words we use are a reflection of our lived realities, what does this say about the way we talk about war? The list here is not exhaustive. And in fact, that's part of the conversation that I kind of want to have today too, right? Is to, when all is said and done, what are the words that you can think of, right? There's so many in the community that are related to war that we don't question anymore. And so, and with the goal, you know, of course, of really disrupting the conversation and the like very linear narrative about the preparation for a future war, right? Because if we are just to look at the media, for example, right now, it's like sign, seal, deliver, future wars coming, right? At least that's like the perspective that's being shared. And it's like we have a very critical and unique, you know, perspective to share when it comes from, you know, our angle, when it comes from really promoting Indigenous sovereignty amidst this really dizzying conversation, you know, about geopolitical power play, about experts, about think tanks, and all of the kind of official narratives that are happening, right? That are really, I mean, I'm curious to have this conversation, right? But to think about like the way that this whole conversation is centering around China and the United States and Russia, right? But really, like here, you're seeing a lot of it happening around China and the US. So again, taking the time to kind of stop and break that down. And these were the terms that I initially, oops, sorry, kind of, there we go, came up with, right? And they were just terms that, again, throughout the years, as I've been doing research and living in the community, right, that were really just very repetitive, you know, whether it was an environmental impact statements, you know, whether it was really official Pentagon documents, whether it was in the news and the media. And I was thinking about things like these terms, right? Readiness, pivot, even US Indo-PACOM, like when did it go, you know, from PACOM to US Indo-PACOM? Steward and deterrent, preparedness, build up, forward presence, and even something as like straightforward as base, right? And so I worked with the graphic designer, and I actually was paired up with a mentor who is Lehua Taitanos. That was really awesome experience. And it just started to kind of break down these terms, right? So again, we can have like a conversation about this, but one of them, of course, is strategic, right? This term, and I'm not, you know, I feel that this term in particular, like of the amount of change that we are witnessing around us because of this particular term, I feel is quite enormous, right? And so it's not just pointing out the word, but when you're looking at a word, you're getting the opportunity to think about the way that the word has been constructed, right, throughout the years, and like what kinds of resources and media and messaging has gone into the creation of this place as strategic, right? And so I went through a lot of different media and a lot of archives and stuff to look at the way that the term was used. And I also, throughout the booklet, really juxtaposed the term with basically the dictionary definition, right? Because even just looking at the dictionary definition sometimes is kind of stunning, right? To again help us take a step back and look at what the word means. And then I had words like steward in here as well. And I actually maybe I want to kind of scroll through the booklet as we talk a bit. But, steward is one word in particular that has been incredibly jarring, I think, in a lot of the documentation about the Marianas and the buildup, and I mean, and militarization in general. So I had right on this particular page, for example, you see Stewie, which is actually the US Navy's environmental mascot that they've created. And there's a screenshot of the actual environmental stewardship outreach video that they have online, right? And again, this was really a moment to say, okay, this is what steward is, right? But what does steward mean in our community, right? Like how are we experiencing this? This is really greenwashing, right? Because what this is another on the right side there, you see, oh, I can't read it on there. Can you read that, Nick? Being a good steward of the environment. The military is committed to being a good steward of the environment, right? And that was like one of the things that they really pushed and continue to push as we're seeing the destruction of the environment around us, right? But there's always this conversation about the military as a good steward, right? And then there's other terms like, again, buildup, right? All of these different terms that we're seeing just being repeated over and over again. And again, to take a step back and say, what are these? Also forward presence. The definition of forward presence is forward basing, also known as forward deployment, and forward presence is a practice used by some militaries to establish an enduring presence in a foreign country as a means of power projection and furthering national interests, right? So again, in a lot of these words that we're seeing out here, it's as if the US is working in a kind of foreign country, right, to build its base presence, but we know it's not, and we're always blurring that line between international and domestic, right? So again, what are the words that are being used to justify, increased militarization, quote unquote, all the way out here? And then, at the end, there's this whole list that I don't even get into, but I just kind of put it at the back of the book to think about all of these phrases. There's so many phrases too that we're used to hearing out here. Realistic, free and open, right? Like our islands are actually viewed as realistic training grounds for the Pentagon when they're doing training, right? What does that mean for us out here, right? To call us a realistic training ground is like, that's as real as it gets, right? There is none of that differentiation between simulation and realism there, right? And so that word alone kind of fuses the two, right? And we're no longer a simulation, right? We are the actual environment and place and people in which this training and testing, which are other words that we could break down, are in use. So yeah, and I think I also wanted to just pull up as we have the conversation, right? Just the book itself, so I can kind of scroll through it as we're talking.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, you started with the word strategic, and that's definitely something we've heard for a lot of our, I feel like from a very young age, even that was a word that I heard talking about strategic value, and then the word value being associated directly after the word strategic. So that's our value as an island and a people. And what does that mean? Our economic value, our cultural values, all of that. And then also that it's because of our strategic value that we've been colonized. Like strategic value equals our colonization from
Right.
Spain to Japan to the United States. And so yeah, all of them. And so I think it's quite interesting that and strategic. No, that's
Mhm.
really I love how intentional the book opens with that word strategic and how it has been used to us, and it's almost like that's our only value. That becomes our only value then is our strategic location, which is the justification for our colonization and occupation.
Right. Imagine that though, right? Like that process that just happens so swiftly, right? And you're right, it is. It's about use value. So it's about value in so much as we are useful for ABC, right? And in this case, value and that we're useful in so much, for this military project and that military project, right? And this type of training, right? And yeah, um,
Or
it
war, that our only value is for war, to
or
be a
right.
war.
That's why caught in the crossfire bothers me so much, and it's just such again, a moment to take a step back because it's this way of describing us as, you know, this attitude of, we're always going to be stuck between two bigger powers, right? Let's just put our seatbelts on and get ready. Don't even bother arguing, right? Because it's going to happen. And so there's no agency, there's no conversation about, what would a sound policy with a larger power look like? What would a successful, navigating, uh foreign relations with China look like, for example, right? Like, what is the plan for that? And what would that look like other than, what we're seeing now, which is really a lot of fear mongering, right? About larger, more powerful countries, and then us being really kind of, quote unquote, stuck in the middle of it all. So really challenging, and you'll see also in the book, and I didn't show this earlier, but basically there are also it's interspersed with community perspectives, right? About the terms, because it's not always so simple. It's not always like there's this term and people resist it, or this term and people accept it, right? There's a lot of like thinking through like how complicated the relationship is with the US military, for example, right? With such high enlistment rates, what does it mean for us to even question these terms, right? What is at stake in actually saying, hold on, actually that's not stewardship. That's not what we know as Chamorro people, right? Of what steward is. That's not how we see it. Or, you know, um, and you can see like this quote in particular, right? Like when I think of the word steward, I think of a steward of our island, someone who protects both the land and sea. I think this is how people who live in the Pacific should view themselves. Everyone who lives or even just comes to our islands must be good stewards who nurture our environment to promote sustainability and good health for our current population and also for future generations, right? And then you have other perspectives that are more like Tracy's down here, she'll say, our relationship with the US military is complicated and it's a sensitive topic. So you're seeing like community perspectives really, again, it's not just this like I'm for or against, it's not so black and white. It's like, how do these terms take root in the community? How have we really, engendered a lot of these terms and accept them as reality, right? And where do we really want to shift the narrative? Where do we want to be part of the conversation around unpacking, breaking them down, and then really like shifting the conversation, right? Because shifting the conversation could mean shifting our future. I mean, and in fact it does. And I think that's what it means in our work, right? To really push back on a lot of so much of what we accept as just truth and reality about, again, the use value of these ancestral homelands, you know. We're so much, we know that, right? We're so much more than that, but
Yeah,
it's bringing those
like,
conversations to light.
I mean, we can go and talk more about these words a little bit further. I really kind of want to go back to Stewie, the sea turtle, who's the mascot for the military, uh, for the Navy, you know, and it's like, and you think about like how many times, like over the years, there've been in the news like stories about like you know, certain activities being paused because of sea turtle nesting, and the so the Air Force cancels their beach landing. Oh, aren't they good stewards? You know, like, or they're counting turtle nests along the beach, you know, and on the base, but also they're allowed a take of how many turtles they can kill, you know, in the murk, in
Right.
the
Take is another really
another word, right?
beautiful euphemism. Yeah.
You know, or how many whales and all kinds of other sea creatures and coral reef, you know, is part of that take, right? The
Yeah.
take is the authorized killing, murder, slaughter of sea creatures. A lot of them are protected by federal law, but this is almost like an exemption of
Right.
that, where the military is allowed to break Endangered Species Act and many other, you know, laws protecting certain species. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, and then this could cause permanent destruction to the ecosystem, to people in the Pacific who live in the ocean. I mean, there's so much, about this that if you it's just really infuriating. And of course, this is almost like indoctrination, because obviously it's targeted to children. And you and I talk about the time of the language that's also targeted to children
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
and
whole
families. That's a whole
and a
other.
whole other section. Yeah. No, but I mean, I think what you're speaking to is so important because it's about, you know, these are things that are legal, you know, like takes, right? We can't, their thing, you know, I think at one point, I think it was in 2020, the military was authorized legally to take up to something like 16 million marine mammals for a 5-year period in the North Pacific, right? So I think part of what's important about breaking down the words too is really speaking back to not just the jargon, but the kind of legalized way that killing happens, you know, in this often very secretive and very like formulaic way that gets processed through very difficult you know, documents like an environmental impact statement that are really difficult to challenge, right? And so like part of what I was thinking about in a project like this is like, how do we do something that's totally different, right? Taking a term that's not like shrouded in secrecy, for example, but it's just part of an everyday conversation. And that was a kind of a resistance, really, like a way to think about, you know, how we can talk freely and openly. So like directly responding to the secrecy and the jargon of the way that the Pentagon likes to portray itself and to talk and you know, everything behind the lens of security, right? And so like, how can we just completely flip the script on that conversation and in a way resist that you know, again, also a very strong narrative, right, about because it kind of gives us permission to talk, you know, to share from our own perspectives rather than feeling like we need to be some sort of expert, for example, to talk about stewardship, you know, right? Something like stewardship. Yeah. And so speaking of children, right? Again, one of the things that happened during the process of creating this booklet was a number of events were happening in our community, including Pet a Jet, right? Which was really a community call very much geared towards children because they announced it to different schools, right? So parents were invited to bring their children to this event where you could quote unquote pet a jet or experience, touch, see some of the planes, even if they were cargo planes, because I heard a lot of people saying, well, they were just cargo planes. Well, it doesn't matter, right? What were they? What did they contain? What were they holding? That were part of an active war exercise, right? Like Cope North, for example. And so that to me was a perfect kind of exemplification or example, of the desensitization to the terms that, you know, that deal with war and killing and violence, and it was happening all around us, right? And they're using these really violent technologies, they're using, dropping bombs essentially, but what we see is the really almost fun feeling, again, um, you know, almost docile, like, angle to all of this training and testing that I really think is detrimental to our understanding of the bigger picture of how we're linked to the militarization of other Pacific islands that we're seeing, right? That we're linked to the hyper militarization of Palau, Yap, Hawaii, right? All of these other exercises that where they're literally dropping thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of ammunition and bombs and things into the water that we don't know where they're going, right? We just don't know how these things are going to impact them. And we can't rely on an environmental impact statement that says all of this is negligible. It's all negligible. And so, yeah, again, a moment to really reflect on,
Yeah.
yeah, especially to towards children, right? Like that's
Yeah.
where it starts.
Yeah, we have Petajet field trips here as well, but there are so many things wrong with it, normalizing war and violence, and you're absolutely right. These may be cargo planes, but these are still planes used. They're still warcraft, and it normalizes. And so it's almost like a layer to effect, because like if some of the language, like plays it down, makes it friendly and fun, and normalizes it. There's just so much, that language just works at so many layers to desensitize us, to detach us,
Mhm.
um, and to trick us into, not even understanding, or not being able to even explain, or having to constantly re-explain and defend what we're experiencing, what we know to be true. Like the word mitigation is something I really struggle with, you know, mitigation, as if it's going to help, respond to a problem when they're the ones creating the problem. It's like, to save the village, we got to burn it down sort of thinking. So, it's like, hey, we're doing all this great work to help the island deal with invasive species and the loss of birds. Well, we also lost birds because the brown tree snake was brought in,
Right.
possibly, probably in military cargo. So it's like it's all this stuff, all these layers. But what's another word you want to jump into? Because there's so many things I'm responding to in the book, but
Yeah.
what would you like to talk about next?
I mean, mitigation, I agree too. That's such an interesting word too, because oftentimes when you look at the strategies that they use to talk about like what the actual mitigation is, for example, they're often almost laughable, right? So like, for example, in the MIT EIS, the Mariana Islands Training and Testing EIS, right? A lot of um the mitigation concerns about sea turtles, for example, are like having a lookout to make sure that there's no turtles in the way when they're doing an exercise, right? So again, like you can only mitigate so much, and then you can't mitigate your way out of like destruction of the environment to a certain point, right? And yeah, and so that term is also just very, very interesting. I mean, I think preparedness for me was kind of struck me when I was creating the booklet, because I mean, look at the definition, right? It's a state of readiness, especially for war. And I was really shocked by that, because I mean, I think it showed that, the word itself is rooted in war. you know, like the word preparedness. So I mean that term itself is already just so you know, there's no hiding it in that particular word. It's right all there in the definition. And then also just like, you know, what preparedness means in the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, for example, right? So if I can make this closer here. And readiness is very similar, right? So the National Defense Strategy directs the department to employ its resources in ways that enhance the lethality, resilience, agility, and readiness of the joint force, right? And so you also have Ken Gofigan Cooper's response, which was really interesting. And he asked these really important questions in this response, right? But he says, when the military talks about preparedness, they're really talking about mission preparedness. And if you look at the ultimate mission of the United States military, it's to protect the United States interests no matter where you are. So military preparedness may sound from one perspective like a good thing because it means the US military is prepared for any conflict, potential flashpoint, may be prepared to bring in humanitarian and disaster relief missions. Those are also, you know, good terms to break down. But we have to look at what goes into preparedness, right? A lot of their preparedness, especially when it comes to the islands, especially Guam and the CNMI, it comes at a price for us, right? It usually means potential effects on our environment, dredging of reefs, taking of land, bringing more troops in, things like that. Overall, we can't look at preparedness from what angle, but what it looks like for us as a community, right? So this is really like, I mean, striking at a lot of the themes of the book, right? And he also mentions that's where we as a community have to do a better job of investigating the process. And then this question too that I have, which he mentioned here, is what are we preparing for, right? So even the buildup, you know, I mean, if we go to the term buildup, it's like, where is it all going, right? Like the word buildup itself is assemble or accumulate something by putting parts or material together. You know, and the second definition is make a person or their body stronger. And so, you know, you're thinking about what are we assembling? What are we accumulating to? What are we building up to, right? What's the kind of end goal of all of this? And does it, and of course, with all of the conversations that are happening around us now with China and things like that, is it actually making us safer? Are we actually safe? Is this defense, right? Again, all of these terms. I mean, the same could go for the term security, right? Which is so much of the conversation that we're having as well, you know, both in the CNMI and in Guåhan, right? Are we actually secure, right? At the end of the day. And it turns out that often we're not, right? Often the military infrastructure that's being built up all around us is pretty shoddy, you know, and can't actually, you know, protect the way it's saying it is. But you need this rhetoric you need this kind of rhetoric to build the narrative that everything that's going on around us is for the sake of security and that it will work, right? You need that security blanket.
Right. And we've really heard like the term genuine security being thrown around a lot, which is so frustrating because it's an actual framework developed by feminist activist scholars with the International Women's Network Against Militarization, where they're talking about, you know, what that means, which is like to live in harmony with the environment. Everyone has safe housing, access to clean water, where you can practice our culture. Like it's very specific things. It is not aligned at all with the military industrial complex,
Right.
with colonialism, with imperialism, with capitalism, with extractivism, but it's being thrown around a lot and people don't understand like just even the threats to our clean water that militarization can bring, that's the opposite of genuine security, that the destruction of all this forest for the base is the opposite of genuine security. And so when people throw it around, it's irresponsibly, it's just doing a tremendous, it's just taking away the meaning of those words altogether and confusing us. But then
And yet
also
it gets co-opted so often, right? Like that term gets co-opted so often, like genuine security, because it's like steward, it's just like steward.
yeah. And then even like mitigate, it's like mitigate the harm. Don't cause the harm. Why just stop, just don't cause this harm that you know, you can't really mitigate that harm. You know, you're not gonna, there's no way you're gonna mitigate the destruction of like thousands of year old forest, jungle, coral reef, you know, thousands of year old ancestral burials. Like it's just that, just don't harm those things. And
Yeah.
but but security and safety in the buildup, like even like you said, just this idea that things are going to be built up to this certain strength, that they're going to withstand war and protect us from missiles and things like that. Like just even looking at the destruction of the bases after the, you know, the recent super typhoon last year. Now they want $10 billion to rebuild all of that. I mean, it's just, and then also not to mention like all the money to build the infrastructure to protect those that investment and those resources, and not, and really not us in terms of like whether it's bomb shelters or anything like that. Like there's just such a, we're constantly being fed all of this jargon, these euphemisms, this language to really confuse us and and distract us from what's really happening and how we're really being impacted.
Yeah, exactly. This whole process has been really intense. Like it's just words, right? It's just supposed to be words, but the intensity of the process of seeing all of these words on paper and taking a step back and saying, we are not meant to be in this process of security. We are outside of these conversations. We really are. You know, like these, it's like you were just saying, it's like an after effect, right? Like we have to think about everything that comes after, right? They're going to build up. It's, you know, that idea that, okay, there's a buildup, it's happening, we're here, we're going to do it. Even that, right? It's like, there's no, like, that term alone and what it meant and legally what it meant and all the process of what it meant, it's so unclear, even like where people could insert themselves in the conversation to say, hold on, like, is there a possibility in this process to say like, halt, stop, where's the consent, like all of those conversations, right? And the jargon really does that. It what is the word that I'm looking for? I don't, it kind of demobilizes, it freezes you where you are. And of course, like one of the most popular refrains that I know you're used to hearing, right, is like, we can't do anything anyway, we're already bought out, right? We can't do anything anyway. And man, these terms are really a reflection of the way that thinking has like come into being and come into reality, right? So many, including, again, going back to strategic, right? That we can't ever be anything other than stuck between something, that we can't really be part of the active political theorizing, the indigenous theory making, which we're all engaging in, of course, by the way, right, daily. But all of those conversations and really critical perspectives get drowned out for this, you know, in favor of this really homogenous, you know, what they call the Pacific, the oldest command center, the Indo-Pacific, right? And it's really hard to speak to participate in that conversation when that language is being written for you, right? And when it's taking root in your community in really particular ways. And so, you know, of course, even in this conversation, right, it's an opportunity to uproot all of that and reshape and replant and plant other, you know, my mentor Lahua was such an important part of having that conversation of like, what are the words that take root in the community, and what are the words that we want to uproot and replant? What are the words we want to bring into the conversation, right, to replace? You know, there's invasive species, there's endemic species. Like we were thinking of it in terms of planting, right, and growth and resurgence and renewal. And so, you know, of course, it's just a teeny tiny part of a broader conversation that so many of us are part of having. But it's essential. It's the only way for us to truly engage in sovereign decision making and to promote our sovereignty, you know, as Indigenous peoples in the Marianas.
Oh, that's, yeah, thank you Thank you. So that's just such a beautiful metaphor, really, but also just yeah, just a great way of looking at it. Replanting, redefining, um, reclaiming, yep, re-examining all of the language around us. Something that like we hear a lot is tip of the spear, and that's something that I personally take issue with. If we could talk about that for a second, it is in the list of your booklet on like other words for us to think about. And um you know, I personally first heard tip of the spear more than 10 years ago. Fuetsen Famalawan was doing a screening of an Australian film, Tip of the Spear, and it was at the University of Guam. And there was an amazing panel of activists from Guåhan and Okinawa and other parts of the Pacific here for an international women's conference as well. And gosh, you know, it really came to be associated with the relocation of Marines from Okinawa to Guam and the quote buildup, that we're the tip of the spear. But you know, like a lot of us have heard people like Maget and Ken say, you know, things like, oh, the tip of the spear is the first to be broken and bloodied in battle, and it's abandoned, you know, as the warrior moves forward in battle, the spear is broken. And but also like the spear for us is it was bone. It could have been whalebone or marlin bone or ancestral bone even. Like it's a sacred, it could be a sacred object. It's all these things together. But tip of the spear now, it really bothers me when that our leaders have like taken pride. There's no pride in claiming that we're the tip of the spear. There's no pride in claiming that we're the first to be sacrificed. Yeah, you know, at the American war front, we're the you know, are the first to be, like, we're the first strike community, so we're the first battlegrounds. It's just yeah, all
Yeah.
of that. It's so horrible. And it really bothers me that people just throw it around so casually. And you and I've talked about this. People kind of appropriate it. They're not always successful in trying to convey whatever they're critiquing in that word in the way they use it. But hearing our own leaders claim it, like we are the tip of the spear, and saying it with pride has been quite demoralizing and disappointing. And
Yeah.
almost, yeah. You
I mean,
want to,
that's a direct product of our colonial history, right? Like to take these things as points of pride rather than contention or like, again, hold on, you know, what's happening here. And it's technically supposed to mean like the first, like you said, the first to do something, right? And yet the circularity of that phrase has been amazing. Like the way that the military has used that phrase, not just here, but in places like Hawaii, right? So who's the first? I don't know, you know, but what I do see happening with that phrase in particular, right, is that the meaning of it is, you know, they're using it to try to make it sound like, again, you should be so proud because you're the first, right? But really in this system of militarization, in this process, in this really systemic issue that we're seeing, you know, we're mistaking strategic for special, you know, and that we are not special. We are not, I mean, if one thing could come out of the language that's used, it's that, and that you research and you see again the circularity of and the recycling of the terms in so many different militarized places throughout the world, right? You realize, oh my gosh, like we are not special, but we've really, you know, we've really in this system like come to embody this sense of like, you know, yes, we're going to be part of this defensive posture. We're going to be part of promoting quote unquote freedom. I mean, freedom is also such a tenuous word, right? Freedom and democracy. So, you know, free and open again is on at the end of the booklet too. But that idea that, and I think that's why it's so successful actually in a way for the military to say that, right? Because who doesn't want to be part of promoting freedom and democracy and a sense of openness, right? In all of this. And again, that's a direct outcome of our colonial and the propaganda that we're surrounded by constantly, right? But it's interesting because these guides and the booklet, for example, are trying to really get at what is actually free and like what is actually open, when we really start to dig into these terms, they're that's why we call them Orwellian, right? Because they're quite the opposite. In fact, they're unabashedly opposite. They're like using the power of, that oppositeness to to garner support, for whatever military planning that we're seeing is happening. And at the end of the day, um it's it sounds so simple, right? But it's absolutely oppressive. It's demarcating, it's drawing lines about the way we can see ourselves in the world, about the way we are allowed to talk about ourselves in the world. And kind of any time we challenge that rhetoric or that narrative, we're faced with an extreme backlash, right? Like, of course, one of the things that we're so used to hearing is anti-American, right? Anti-American, like, if you challenge any of the rhetoric, that's kind of like the first thing that emerges, right? And so that the conversation isn't doing very well and that you really aren't dialoguing if you're met with those like trump cards, um and a lot of those, again, a lot of these terms, that's why they've been so, again, I hate to use the word successful, but in that sense, right? And successful in the sense that they promoted more militarism, is because it's so difficult to think outside of them. It's so difficult to think like beyond them, right? But we're doing it. We're still doing it. Like you said, International Women's Network Against Militarism, to call something genuine security, to call it out, to rename it, again, just existing on our ancestral lands, just reclaiming our relationships to that space. It will always be there, right? But it takes a lot of work to bring it to kind of the forefront of the conversation, right? And also just because, again, we're so inundated by it, even ourselves, even us who are so used to being, more critical of this terminology, even we have to kind of take a step back to think about the way, right? I say DOD all the time, right? I say Department of Defense. And again, that's why it's like I had to retrain myself as we were creating, and we all kind of did, right? We would laugh because we would be using all these military like euphemisms as we'd say, we didn't even know if this one was militarized, but it sounds very militarized. We'd say, let's take a shot at that. Let's do bullet points, right? Like all of these like ways that militarized language has infiltrated our everyday speech, right? So it takes a lot of like training. Yeah, sorry, right. Let's be more targeted with this. Like all of that language that we've just, that has been so naturalized, it's taking and will take a very long time to unpack and to speak more truthfully, right? Because if we're all part of the system, again, no one is exempt. And this goes for, people within the institution, within the Pentagon themselves, right? This could be useful for them because this is the language they're asked to use all the time too.
Like I think about even like signage, the signage in camp, and even the naming like of Camp Laws, the Marine base, like that's a really good example of, the Marines intentionally naming the base after a Chamorro hero, a Marine and a congressman, Ben Blas, to force closeness. But like even all the signage, there's a lot of the street names that have to do with like war exercises or people in military history. They erase the ancient village names, the place names, the ranches that were there, right? But then also like the main gate sign has these laddie stones on them, like these concrete laddie stones. And we see it in everywhere. We see it in Kmart, we see it at the new Donkey shopping mall. But the bases are really interesting to see these laddie stones because they have literally destroyed laddie stones and burials and all kinds of other, material remains of our ancestors. The sacred objects that they touched, to build that base. And so but it's to force that closeness. And one of the words that really bothers me is the word sacrifice, how it's always used it implies that we had a choice in things. We had a choice to have war here. We had a choice to lose so much of our land. We have a choice to continue to being a place for war. None of that is, these are, the sacrifices of our war survivors. They didn't choose to go through that brutal experience that, is not very far away in our history, really. It's just a few generations away from us. It's still very much a part of who we are. And for a lot of us, watching everything that's happened, the destruction of land that's happened since then, it's like the war hasn't ended. I mean, we're still finding explosives and all kinds of contaminants around from that time. And so sacrifice is something I really can't stand, that word, because it implies we have a choice, and it also implies loyalty. And that's another thing, is like all of this talk about loyalty really erases how we've been coerced into these relationships of dependency, and how it's cyclical, and how it continues to feed the military industrial complex, because we're dependent. We're stuck in these cycles of poverty. We're stuck in these cycles, where this, this is an option, the only option for a lot of young people. They believe they can't get a job or go to school here, so they join the military. It's the first ticket off Guam or off Saipan or out, and we're also the recruiter's paradise. Like all these horrible words, really, used to also normalize that part of, so that our kids have been so desensitized, our folks have been so, conditioned with this language, and then we're feeding the military industrial complex directly. We're feeding the war machine, the death machine directly. It's so important that we look at every news article, every TV report, and every scholarly article, to really analyze the language that's being used, but also what's being manipulated, what's being hidden, what's being misrepresented, to serve an agenda that's not ours, that we're not even a part of, but that is literally so destructive, literally poisoning air and water and land, literally setting us up to be sites of war.
Right.
Nothing normal about that.
Nothing is normal about preparing for war. So why are we so resigned to accept that as, fate? And we really have to ask ourselves that question: why are we so resigned, right? And where can we really strategize ourselves, and make inroads, and again, shifting that conversation, shifting that narrative, and also, we're having this conversation now, so how can we take it and apply it, to what we're seeing, right now, around us, right? We're seeing a lot of emergent anti-People's Republic of China messaging, right? Anti-PRC messaging that absolutely does not allow us to adequately assess a real and credible, even threat. It's hard to even say that, right? But where are credible threats, if there are any coming from? How can we respond? How can we disarm, rather than continue to build up and provoke, right? I think those are the conversations that will promote a sense of sovereignty and a sense of political decision making from our vantage point. Yes, we are having these conversations with the United States, but we still have our own unique sovereignty and our own unique vantage points that we have to deal with in conversation with the US oftentimes, right? But if we're hearing all of this, China bad, US good, it's a really excellent opportunity to again take a step back and say, who is this messaging serving, right? And what is that fear? Anytime you feel a deep sense of fear that these words are promoting, that sense of fear, we should always be asking ourselves, what is that fear motivating us to do? Where is it telling me to think, in so many, what direction is it pushing me towards, right? What is that word pushing me to want to do, or who to stop liking and who to start seeing as an enemy, right? And those are the kind of conversations that, we would hope would come from these moments. that we're seeing again all around us, and that it's okay, questioning something like a military buildup doesn't mean you're pro this or pro that. It's never that simple, right? We know that by now, that living in this environment, it's always so much more complicated and nuanced, than that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And gosh, just thinking again about how the language feeds apathy, and how apathy is what's also killing the planet and perpetuating the cycles of war and the military industrial complex. This apathy, like what's happening, quote, far away doesn't, impact me. What's happening over there has nothing to do with me. When in reality, our connections to the genocides happening all over the world, to the destruction that's taking place, the devastation of Palestinian land and lives, for instance. It's what's happening in Kanaki, what's happening in West Papua, what's happening in Congo and Sudan, all of this, what's happening in Hawaii, what's happening in the Philippines, it's all connected to the project of the military industrial complex, to these extractive economies, and that we are sort of a part of that big net of imperialism, fascism, colonization, and anything we do really to pull at some of the threads we're doing, as activists, whether it's like this important counter narrative work with these guys that you're doing on the ground, counter narrative work, like people, it's interesting how people, just going back to how we started this conversation with the word activist, how people really are so dismissive of the critical work of activists, saying like, oh, that's not us, that's the activists, they're just out there holding signs. But we are changing the language. We are addressing the language very directly, whether it's in campaigns for comments, whether it's in social media, whether it's in solidarity work, whether it's in legal strategy, whether it's in advocacy, like we're always engaging in this process of, finding meaning, or even breaking it down, because some of it is really difficult and very layered, like you've mentioned. So and then some of it is very straightforward, and we're made to think that it's not, that it's more complicated, right? But just thank you so much. Thank you for creating, being a part of creating the resources that are Words Beyond War, Words About War Matter, but also creating this very specific resource for the Mariana Islands, something that it just is so helpful to our folks and to those of us engaged in this kind of work, right? Where we are trying to help develop media literacy. We're trying to help develop critique or encourage people to analyze things or reframe things or even investigate things in a different way, right? Like, so thank you so much for creating these resources and for sharing them. And I feel like our Commonwealth 670 is really has been doing that work, whether looking at things like economic colonization to things like medical colonization, to things like and how those things are connected to militarization, and things like even conservation, right? Conservation language, all of that, all the greenwashing and the brownwashing, all of that, those are strategies. Those are strategies to take away our agency, to take away our voice, to take away our power, to make us believe that everything is normal and okay when it's absolutely not. And so yeah, just thank you so much for your your commitment to this work, and for all of the your ideas, your words, and everything you offer to the movement. And it's also so important that between the islands we talk more too,
Right.
and so it's an
Yes.
honor to do that with you.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Algamas. Honestly, this is obvious, we're always talking about these things, but this is but a tiny, tiny sliver of just the conversation that you all have been such a critical voice for, an important part of. And it's true, we're seeing that this solidarity work is so critical across islands, even just within our own islands, right? Because so many of these words are seen from out here as a Guam thing, right? That's a Guam problem. No, it's not. Militarization is it's planetary. It's planetary. It's so far beyond, you know, us, a region. It is shifting, literally shifting the world, the climate, politics, everything as we know it, right? And so if we can just continue to be part of that conversation around divesting from like death, um, you know, we're in it together, and I'm so grateful again to Miget as well, and to you for all of your hard work. I mean, really, the movement, the demilitarization movement as we know it would be nowhere without your leadership and guidance, and these collective conversations that, you know, we're always trying to get through. It's a difficult process, right? And it's an ongoing process that we're all involved in. Sometimes we forget that, right? And words are really good with that. They're really good at phrases with the period at the end, right? Like the Pentagon has its phrases and they're declarative and they're done, right? And I think these conversations are always a part of that, ripping things back open again. The currency, right, of these conversations, of this particular moment, when we're witnessing a genocide, right, before our eyes. And there's no other way to see these things except as so deeply interconnected, right, and so deeply entwined with one another. And if anything, that's, I don't know, it's not a silver lining, but it's something that we've all kind of gleaned from the collective work together, right? Again, is to witness the way that the, you know, militarized ideologies are so global and they're so circular and they've been recycled so many times, you know, and we're here to try to break that cycle, break out of that cycle, right? And it's possible. To also say that it's possible.
Absolutely, it's possible, and we have to say that as much as often as we can. Absolutely, it is possible. Thank you so much, Dr. Arriola, for this great conversation and for your work, and thank you for helping us make all these connections, you know, to what's happening around the world, to the way we see it and the way we interpret it and the way we talk about it. And it's just been an honor to have you, and just looking forward to continued solidarity work together. And of course, you know, we're thinking about everybody in Rafah right now as we're having this conversation, everybody in Gaza and in the West Bank, and all oppressed peoples around the world, our Kanaki brothers and sisters struggling for their independence. I mean, we have to think about words like fascism, Zionism, racism, white supremacy, colonization also, and we need the frameworks and the language to recognize it so we can fight it everywhere and anywhere that it exists, because our struggles are connected, and of course so is our liberation. And so thank you so much, Dr. Arriola, for joining us for this episode of Fanachu, and we'll talk soon. We'll talk again very soon. All right.
Viva.
Viva. Yeah, thank you again, Sanamasi Kirso, and please give our best to your community and your beautiful family. And again, I'm Monaeka Flores, and with us was Dr. Isa Arriola from our Commonwealth 670, and here with Independent Guåhan and Prutehi, Litekyan for this Fanachu. Adjust. Sanamasi, everybody.